Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group, and our guest today is Jay Cost, who has an appointment. Jay Cost is his undergraduate degree from UVA was in political science, I believe, and then a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and he's been a journalist commentator for about 20 years with Real Clear Politics, The Weekly Standard, and National Review. He also has an appointment at Grove City College's Institute for Faith and Freedom and is a fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. So, well-known political commentator, but also well-known as an historian. He's written two really good books on the founding period. Actually, I see more Jonathan has put up. The Price of Greatness on Hamilton and Madison, and James Madison, America's First Politician. So, Jay, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me so much. I'm so appreciative to be here. I really appreciate it. So I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, James Madison is one of my favorite historical figures and political figures. And so I want to know what drew you to James Madison as someone you wanted to now write a book and a half about.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, a book and a half. There's a lot I like personally about Madison. I like his sense of self-composure that, some of the founders like Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris were characters, larger than life people who often let their emotions sometimes get the better of them.
Yeah.
But Madison was very cautious and very studious and highly disciplined as an individual and very extremely thoughtful. I find all of those things appealing. And then, the other thing I really have appreciated about Madison, at least from a professional standpoint that has been good for me, is that I think that he's been misunderstood. That was the mainspring of my last book, The Price of Greatness, which is actually based on my dissertation, arguing that the recent sort of rise of, Hamilton was right and Madison was inconsistent, actually misunderstands Madison.
Yeah.
That got me thinking more about Madison's political philosophy in general. And the more I looked at it, the more I liked it. It resonated with me. And so the biography is an extension of all of that. The biography is really more than anything an intellectual biography.
Right. Yeah, you say your subtitle is America's First Politician. So you're looking at him in that sense. I think we denigrate the term politician, but you're really looking at Madison as someone who's a lifelong practitioner of the arts of politics. Sometimes he called them the vicious arts, but really seeing that he's not a visionary, but he's a realist, and he's working within this really interesting framework into creating the system of power. I'm starting to ramble on the way an historian does, but you do a really good job of presenting Madison as a consistent figure. Not that he's always right, but he's always operating with these principles. I mean, you contrast him with someone like Patrick Henry, and you say it's never really clear what Henry's principles are.
Yeah, Henry's principles were usually do the opposite of what Jefferson wants.
Yeah. And sometimes I guess there's a merit in that, but
yeah, there definitely was. Yeah. No, I mean, I think so. My argument about the reason I call Madison America's first politician, and obviously he was not the first, politician in a literal sense of the word, but I mean it in two senses of the word. I mean it in the sense that it was Madison, I think, more than anybody else at the Constitutional Convention, presented the idea of politics, well-ordered politics, as a way to secure justice in a republic. This had been a burning question since classical antiquity. How does a republic, or how does any form of government maintain itself? And the Americans had rejected the British system, which was from Montesquieu, or Montesquieu had praised the mixed nature of the British institution, which is reminiscent of the ancient scholars, right? Like having a government of the one and the few and the many. Polybius had argued for that, argued the merits of that. And the Americans just by default really had rejected that with the Declaration of Independence, booting the king. And the king, of course, had created no hereditary aristocracy in America. So America was by default going to be government of the many. And then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we make sure that the many behave themselves, since there's not going to be another faction or individual or entity like a king or like the hereditary aristocracy to watch out for them? And Madison's argument, I think, boiled down to the word politics, that if we organize a political process to facilitate compromise and to facilitate a broad compromise, that way that will temper the potential dangers of what we today call democracy or the rule of the people. So that's one sense. But then the other sense, I think, in which we need to understand Madison is a man of politics in a new way, in several different ways. The first being that he was, if not the first, but certainly one of the first professional politicians. Most men of politics in the 1780s would have simultaneously had some other job, in large measure because politics didn't pay that well. Madison didn't have to do that because his father was sufficiently wealthy and sponsored his son. So Madison could give his full energies to politics in a way that even somebody like Jefferson could not. But also, if you look at Madison's political career, you see his efforts as a consistent, I would say, generally consistent, not all the time. Sometimes he would let his passions and his anger at the Federalists get the better of him, but generally living out the way he thought politics should function ideally. Politics is supposed to be a forum in which compromises are reached, differences are minimized, mutual accommodation is achieved. You look at his career, you see very frequently that that's what he's trying to do. And I really think it's a through line from his time in the Confederation, the Confederation Congress or the Continental Congress in 1781, all the way through 1815, 1816, 1817 at the very end of his political career.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And you mentioned that the other biographers of him or anyone who studied him has segmented his career and seeing that there are shifts. There's the nationalist, and there's the exponent of the Kentucky resolutions, and then of course there is Secretary of State, President when he and Jefferson are in power, and then how do they grapple with the bank, other features, and there is a consistency there that they're operating with this respect for precedent and as well as for nature of this political system that he's helped to create, and when he's writing the Federalist, he's actually arguing for things he hadn't really supported at the convention. The Senate having an equality of the states having an equal voice in the Senate, other things that he had thought were a bad idea, but here it's accepted, and so he's defending it. It's really he's an interesting thinker in that way, in that not that he's temporizing, but that he is yielding to when he says, okay, maybe a bank is constitutional after all, because we've had it for 20 years. I thought it was unconstitutional, but American people seem to have accepted it. So
and I think two things I want to emphasize in that. I agree with your point. I would say, for instance, if a common mistake that's often made when we read the Federalist Papers, and I think this even goes back to college kids, even high school students, but like when you take a class in political theory, you're going to read Hobbes, and you'll read Locke, and you'll read Hume, and then you'll read the Federalist Papers, as if the Federalist Papers were the same type of thing as Locke's second treatise. Madison and Hamilton were arguing in many respects against what they wanted. What's striking to me, for instance, is Federalist 10 is Madison's great defense of the extended republic. But really, the essay is actually more of a defense of his Virginia plan.
Right.
And there were lots of things that the convention dropped from the Virginia plan that Madison thought would be necessary to effectuate the ideal of the extended republic. And yet he's appropriating. That's one example. I'd say another good example that you mentioned is the Bank of the United States. Madison thought it had been unconstitutional. He certainly feared it in the hands of the Federalists, particularly Hamilton. But in the hands of the Republicans like Gallatin, he was less worried about it. And then especially the country keenly felt its absence during the War of 1812. And so Madison, even though Madison was a man of principle, he was also not the sort of person to allow the hard lessons of experience to fall by the wayside. Like he would not sacrifice experience to maintain principle in that respect. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good. We're talking with Jay Cost, author of James Madison, America's First Politician. You also make a point that the Virginians in the 17th century were, Harrington was really their model as opposed to Locke. That is, they have thought they were living in Oceania, then as opposed to, we know Locke's treatise. Maybe what we're doing is giving college classes in political science other things to read than what they have been reading. But that you're looking at Madison using politics in this national republic as a way of solving these real essential problems of government that, I don't know, every generation seems to have to solve again. Another thing that is really fascinating to me about Madison, of course, is he's the one who gets the statute for religious freedom through the Virginia legislature. And, Madison's thinking about the nature of a political society where you have this religious diversity. It really sets him apart from others of his generation.
Yeah, that is very true. In that regard, Jefferson. So Madison's views on religion and religious toleration, I think, are very interesting, and this is probably one area where he is unfortunately overshadowed by Jefferson. I think there's a couple points to make. The first, with respect to the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, Jefferson authored it. But it was Madison who actually saw its implementation, which I think really illustrates Madison's political effectiveness. I have a chapter in my book where I talk about some really impressive, just sort of kind of backroom politicking, almost politics as a knife fight, that Madison is really good at deploying. And he's very good at those through most of his career in the legislature, right? When he's in a legislative setting, he's extremely formidable. But, the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that even though, Madison, in making his arguments, because he writes his first major written work is the Memorial and Remonstrance on Religious Liberty, which he writes, I believe, in 1784, he's obviously drawing from the same well as Jefferson was. Obviously was influenced by Jefferson's views and also in turn by Locke's views. And Jefferson is sort of taking Locke to its obvious conclusion, right? If these are duties that exist prior to the existence of the state, then why does the state have any established church at all? But Madison, in that essay, in the Memorial and Remonstrance, also anticipates Federalist 10, and it's really an interesting underlying consistency, because Madison points out that factional disputes. He mentions in Federalist 10, factional disputes have been a hallmark of human civilization, that human beings fight over all manner of things. And really, when you look at his list of things, there's two major ones, right? There's economic factions and then religious factions. And in the Memorial and Remonstrance, he makes this point, and from that, he says, the best way to tamp down on religious factionalism, which tends to be very violent and bloody, is to make it so that control of the government has no bearing on the nature of church, right? So that no longer religious factions will not compete for control of the state. And that will sort of dial down the number of potential sources of disunity and factionalism in society. It's a really clever argument. And, it's what's really remarkable to me too, is that I've hit middle age now. It's remarkable to me that he is writing this at the age of 31 years old. It is absolutely amazing to me that somebody that young could make such really interesting, innovative, and novel points that have stood the test of time. It's really remarkable.
It really is. It really is. And he seems somewhat unique. Well, that may be the wrong phrase. In seeing this tendency toward faction as being inherent in human nature. And as he said, people will form factions over all kinds of things. And so we're not creating a system for the better sort of people. We're creating a system for the kind of people we are. So having that clear-eyed view of human nature is really a phenomenon in someone of any age, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and this is one of those ways in which the traditional sort of view of Madison as being under the spell of Jefferson just
Mhm.
strikes me as
Yeah,
wrong, because
yeah, yeah.
Jefferson was really more of a dreamer. He was sort
Oh
of a
yeah,
futurist, for lack of a better term. Like
yeah, yeah.
if you ever visit Monticello, it's just full of all these weird gadgets that
Oh yeah,
Jefferson seems to have thought would be the wave of the future, but never turned out
yeah.
that way. Madison is really his political theory is, even though he was not a professedly religious person and probably
Hmm.
was a deist,
Hmm.
his moral psychology is really grounded in Calvinism, in my opinion.
Interesting.
And I think that's probably a consequence of a couple things. He's very influenced by the moral psychology of Hume, which was also very Calvinistic, even though Hume was an atheist, but Hume was from
Oh yeah,
Scotland, which was very Calvinistic. And then
yeah.
also Madison's educators as a young man, particularly John
Right.
Witherspoon
Hmm.
at Princeton, were Calvinists. Now, I don't, you always want to be mindful to not reduce political philosophy to mere biography, but I do think that
Right.
that's significant. I think it's significant that when he first became what we would say an educated person, he became educated from people who really thought that the human species was something to be feared in many respects,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
it was something that human capacity for goodness was always in danger of being overwhelmed totally by the human capacity for evil. And it seems to
Yeah.
be something that he never made an explicit, okay, I'm going to write an essay on this subject and defend it on my own terms. I mean, part of that is because he was a political philosopher. He wasn't a moral
Yeah.
philosopher, so he didn't have occasion to
Right.
write something like that. But it seems to inform his writing and his thinking from such a young age. It just seems to be one
Hmm.
of his presumptions or assumptions about how to understand politics, is this very dim
Yeah.
view of human nature.
That's very interesting. Of course, he has a cousin who's a bishop,
He does,
and
yes.
but yeah, yeah, yeah. And Henry Adams said that Madison, by all accounts, had a sense of humor, but in his writing, he did his utmost to hide it. Something to that effect. And you mentioned a couple of times Madison's wit, and I wonder if you have any better examples than I have of Madison, who in a small group really could be the life of the party.
Well, it's funny. He was very funny, and if you go and look at his probably the best. And I had these in an earlier draft of the book, but I decided to drop them because it was
Ah,
just getting too long. But he had these. He was in a club. I think it was the Clio Suffolk Society at Princeton, and
mhm,
he wrote these poems. They're terrible poetry, just
mhm,
just terrible. But
mhm.
they're very bawdy. They're actually very
Wow,
they're a little they're kind of PG-13, and so
wow,
he did sort of have that. Uh, he did have that side of him, and people would say that he had a twinkle in his eye too. Is
yeah,
one thing I've heard written, that
yeah,
he sort
yeah.
of had this kind of way about him, um, and that. He was, especially as he got older, he became
Mm,
more lively in conversation. I think Dolly
mhm,
probably had a lot to do with that. But yeah, his writing does not betray that, which it
yeah,
makes in it. If you know which essays in the Federalist paper he wrote and which that Hamilton
mm,
wrote, it becomes
mm,
very obvious. And Hamilton's
mhm,
writing, I think, in many respects, is an outgrowth of his personality. It's very
mhm.
bombastic. It's very confident,
Right,
makes
yeah,
lots of
yeah,
assertions, insults his political opponents all the
mhm,
time,
yeah, oh yeah,
but
yeah,
is also just is brilliant. Don't get me wrong, but
yeah,
Madison
yeah,
had this kind of um, unique attention to detail and making
yes,
sure that his points were made with precision. But the
mhm,
downside is often, and I warn my students about this, is that the downside is often that Madison achieves precision at the sacrifice of clarity. So oftentimes you have to read him very slowly,
mhm, yeah,
and you have to read. Sometimes you have to read a paragraph again. And I
yeah,
would say though that one of the advantages of this, and it was also generally speaking in his political speeches as well, reflected this. And I think that it was a special benefit for him at the time, because he had a way of criticizing his political opponents could be very sharply critical of them, but never in a way that their honor was offended.
Right.
Which, of course, was ultimately Hamilton's downfall.
Oh, yeah.
Hamilton could not keep himself from could not keep himself from offending Aaron Burr. Could not keep himself from offending Burr's honor and drawing out a duel. Nobody ever challenged James Madison to a duel. Even his most relentless political opponents never did that because he was careful.
Well, we're talking with Jay Cost, author of James Madison, America's First Politician. So who were some of Madison's big political opponents?
That's a good question. Patrick Henry would have been top of the list, at least in the 1780s. Frankly, into the 1790s as well. Madison
actually, you have that great
Henry.
quote from Thomas Jefferson saying that he's praying for Henry's death.
Yes, praying earnestly.
Praying earnestly. That's good. Jefferson's off in Paris praying earnestly, but Madison's the one who has to get things through the legislature.
Right. Madison is the one who has to get things done. Henry would be one. There were a number of formidable members of the First Congress who ended up being rivals of him. Jeremiah Wadsworth would be one, probably his most formidable in terms of economic policy. Alexander Hamilton obviously ended up becoming a major opponent of Madison's.
Right.
I would say also another one that I think is noteworthy is they were not political opponents per se, but Madison did not like John Adams. Now, that's not necessarily
really like him.
In that most people didn't like Adams. But of course, Adams was friends with Jefferson. And you would think that would purchase for Madison some credibility. But Madison's dislike of Adams was really his defense of the constitutions of the United States of America, which Madison thought was just, royalism thinly disguised. So Madison didn't like him.
Well, an interesting thing about that, Jay, while you're thinking, is that Madison's idea of a constitution, Adams's idea of the Massachusetts Constitution, they have a lot of similarities. These two ideas about controlling power and dividing it. And so that's, to me, a curious thing that these two guys, and you would think, here in Massachusetts, we do like to say that our Constitution was the model for everything else.
Right.
I'm skeptical of that. Well, I hope no one in Massachusetts, in the Secretary of State's office is listening. But but they don't really like each other.
Yeah, Adams complained about this, and I think he was right that Adams felt like he had been misunderstood. And I think he was misunderstood. But of course, I think one of his problems is that the defenses of the Constitution of the United States was such a long, rambling book, and it was easy to pluck out things that seemed offensive. I would, one other person I would point out to that Madison had, not really rivalry, but it was not all sunshine and roses with James Monroe. That James Monroe, and one of the real hallmarks of Monroe was his inability to hide his ambitions, which was something that one was supposed to do in the 18th and early 19th century. One was not supposed to appear to seek public office, and Monroe did. Monroe tried to, at the behest of Henry, ran against Madison in the first Congress. Now, Madison didn't hold that against him. But later on, when Madison was Secretary of State and Monroe was Minister to England, or he was sort of a floating, special envoy to Europe, Monroe was very worried about how he was being cast politically back in the United States, to the point that he actually circumvented Madison, who was his superior in the State Department, to complain directly to Jefferson, and then, for all intents and purposes, declared himself a candidate in 1808 against Madison, which was that was legitimate line jumping, right? That was the sort of thing that Aaron Burr had done that, and Aaron Burr had poured calumny upon himself. And it's interesting, to be honest, if the War of 1812 had gone better, or indeed had not been fought, that might have been the end of James Monroe's career, but it was only because of the difficult diplomatic situation leading up to the war that Madison had to reconcile with Monroe. And at that point, the reconciliation was a not so
Yeah.
was a not so implicit, almost explicit. All right, you bring your talents into the cabinet, and you'll be the next in line for the presidency.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's that plus the fact that Armstrong, Eustis, the other characters in Madison's cabinet were, well,
Disasters.
incompetent or disastrous. Yeah. I mean, you have that great line about looking at the military political leaders in 1812. You see drunkards, fools, cowards, schemers, and malcontents.
Right.
It's a little reassuring, I think.
Yeah, a little bit.
That, yeah. Okay, so this is you make a lot. It's a great book on Madison because you look at these different facets in such a clear way. And I was just thinking about the 1780s, the time as we know the revolution is ending. No one's the war is ending. I don't think there's that same sense, but this big crisis in 1780 with inability to stabilize the economy, pay the debts, and so on, and then Madison is one of the guys pushing for a 5% impost and other ways of creating a national government. And then suddenly you have these military victories. So we no longer need to think about solving this crisis, these inherent problems, but the problems don't go away. It's really a case of the success making it difficult then to make the changes that Madison knows are necessary to save the republic.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting as well because the war turns around in just an almost fantastical turnaround, right? That by, in May 1780, you could look around and you see Georgia has fallen, South Carolina has fallen, Washington is still being, chased around the mid-Atlantic. And Virginia is being threatened with invasion, and you could say, "Ooh, we're not going to win this thing," Mm-hmm. And then by May 1781, the whole thing's over. I mean, the Americans were, that's a testament to the American success against Cornwallis in his Southern campaign, and that Cornwallis had traded tactical victories in South Carolina and Georgia for a larger strategic defeat. But yes, it did leave them with an enormous problem, which was, to put it bluntly, the government that existed in the 1780s, the national government, the Articles of Confederation, was completely incompetent to the tasks at hand, and that the Americans had won the war despite not because of the government. And so the problems of the government were going to persist. And it wasn't threat of foreign invasion that finally toppled the Articles of Confederation, because that threat, if the war had dragged on for another year and a half, that very probably would have toppled the Articles. But it was the threat in your neck of the woods of domestic insurrection, right?
That's
the threat of Shays' Rebellion. And in particular, I think, I'm not a Beardian by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that Beard was onto something, or at least there was something to be said for the seeming revolt of the propertyless masses, and rising up against the government being an assault not on only the elite, but also the middle class of people with sufficient property that they had a stake in society. And that being the thing that creates a panic sufficient, because what's interesting, the surprising thing about the Constitutional Convention is not that it's called, I think, although that is surprising. The really surprising thing is that the 12 of the 13 states show up, and the only state that doesn't show up is Rhode Island, which really at that point is sort of a mobocracy up there anyway. I think it illustrates the fear that was running around the middle and sort of property classes of society at that point.
Yeah, we're talking with Jay Cost, author of James Madison, America's first politician. So I'm wondering why will there be a Madison musical?
Probably not. Madison doesn't. Madison was 5'4". He weighed 100 pounds. He didn't die. He didn't die tragically. He died quietly in his bed as an old man. It doesn't admit of the same kind of drama of Hamilton's life that can be reimagined as a lavish Broadway show. But I
just thought of a great title. Just thought of a great title though. Hello.
Oh
Dolly.
Yeah. What's that?
Hello Dolly.
Yeah. Now Dolly's life. If you wanted to make a musical about anybody, from that family, it would be it might be Dolly. Dolly was actually, we call automatically the wife of the president is known as the first lady.
Yeah.
But Dolly was the first lady in the sense that when she died, I think in 1849, she was eulogized by President Zachary Taylor as America's first lady. And it was one of the frustrating things actually about writing this book is that there were so many great things to say about Dolly, but I was required by my own constraints writing an intellectual biography that I had to, I could only give the reader a taste of the extraordinary person that was Dolly Madison.
Right. Yeah. Now, of course, one issue, and it comes up in your last chapter, of course, on the serpent, the issue of slavery. It's one Madison does grapple with in many ways over his life, not really successfully, that is coming to recognize the immorality of it. You say that he can't really discern that earlier on, but then trying to find some way of resolving this. He has that little essay about Jonathan and Mary Bull, and the wonderful little advice to my country,
right,
is really framed in terms of the tariff, but he's really thinking about disunion as the big specter. And so where does he stand on the issue of slavery?
Well, Madison was, the way I would put Madison's view of slavery is that he was intellectually embarrassed by it, but it did not prick his conscience in the same way that, say, when Madison observed the Baptists in Virginia having their rights violated, that really offended him. I don't think he felt the same kind of offense over slavery. And so usually Madison did the sorts of things that a self-respecting small R Republican gentleman would do. He supported recolonization. He generally said that slavery was, unjust. At the Constitutional Convention, he bemoaned what he called the mere distinction of color as being the driving force. But he never did anything about it in the sense of using a massive amount of political power that he had acquired or he wielded over the generations. Was never. I'll give you an example of what I mean. It is so that Madison was, one of the things that he wanted to do was guarantee the rights of conscience for people. And so he was really persistent in that. So one of the proposed amendments to the Bill of Rights was protecting the rights of conscience from state infringement, which if that had gone through, that would be a sweeping protection, even more sweeping than what we have today.
Right.
And it got struck down because it wasn't really something that people wanted, except Madison wanted it. And so he was sort of working, another example of what I mean is if you look at the way the Bill of Rights is worded, like the First Amendment is worded in the active voice, Congress shall make no law. But the remainder of the rights are usually worded in the passive voice. It was John Marshall, who said, well, the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states. But Madison was very careful in that and a little sneaky too. And it showed, I think it demonstrates that he was sort of relentlessly interested in protecting individual rights against state encroachment. That was on his mind. He was going to do what he could to inch them in that direction. But he never did anything like that with slavery. He said the right things about slavery when he was basically asked, but he never did the right things. I think like Jefferson, he hoped that the slavery issue would just disappear. Right. Unlike Jefferson, he lived long enough because Jefferson dies in 1826. Madison lives until 1836. He lives long enough to see that not only is slavery not dying, but it is getting a second wind, because what's happening by the 1830s is cotton is revolutionizing the South. Right. Many of his neighbors in Virginia are actually now in the practice of, as breeding slaves, quote unquote. And I think he wakes up to this threat too late and only indirectly. Like as you referenced, his advice to my country is really about disunion, but the nature of the threat of disunion is over how the South is moving away from being what I would say at the time would have been appropriately embarrassed by slavery and hoping someday, like the North, that it would disappear, to now the South is actively looking to expand the slave population to keep up with the demand for cotton. for short staple cotton.
So imagine, Jay, if Madison lived another 20 years, in any sense how he would have reacted when the break begins coming in the 1850s?
I think he would have lamented it, and I don't want to go so far as to say he would have joined the Union, although I think he would have. It's really hard because I'm a fan of Madison. Obviously, I would want him to have joined the Union. But I will say this though: Madison saw himself as a citizen, and from the earliest days, saw himself as a citizen of the United States of America.
Yeah,
saw himself as an American. Before he saw himself as a Virginian, or at least for him, being a Virginian only had meaning and virtue insofar as it was part of America. So the sort of thing that a Robert E. Lee did, right, where Lee basically said, I have to follow my state. I'm obliged to Virginia before I'm obliged to the Union. I have a hard time seeing Madison doing that. I really do. And I think, but you never know, Madison did die. So when Madison died, he dies at the age of 84, I want to say 84, 85. So he was already very old at that point.
And he's writing then when he's encouraged to write about the whole tariff debate, that when someone my age starts writing, people will automatically say it's, you're not what you once were, that it's his mind is given out. So he's conscious of that as he's getting older. It's really a fascinating story. So maybe a musical would be the wrong thing. It sounds more like a tragedy in some ways. Would it be a tragedy?
I think in some ways it is. I think there's a tragic undercurrent to his last writing that was meant for the public, right? Because the advice to my country. Because advice to my country is beware of the serpent of disunion lurking in the garden. And of course, Madison being whether or not he was a believer, certainly knew the Bible and knew that the serpent did in fact deceive Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, that they're whatever Genesis, I think it's Genesis 3, that the serpent does deceive them. And so I there is clearly an anxiety there. And it's what's interesting as well is that he saw this. And it was in many, and there was sort of that was kind of the last thing that he saw too, right? He did not see, for instance, there was a relative calm in the 1840s, or at least the sectional divisions were fought over other things that didn't so immediately threaten disunion. And it looked maybe in the 1840s, it looked like the political process could sufficiently reconcile the sections together. So in a way, when he died, he got like a glimpse of the 1850s, right? Because the nullification crisis is really kind of a prelude of politics after the Compromise of 1850, where things are actually falling apart.
We've been talking with Jay Cost, author of James Madison, America's First Politician. Again, he's one of my favorite historical figures, so I always enjoy talking about him. Anything else? Any favorite Madison stories you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I think probably we sort of talked about this a little earlier, but one of the reasons I like Madison is that he could underwhelm on a first impression. He wasn't not much to look at, but he was formidable. And one of my favorite things about Madison is that, Patrick Henry and Madison have this great showdown at the 1788 Virginia ratifying convention. And, Henry is, even Jefferson admitted that Henry was the greatest orator of his generation, could sell an ice maker to people in Alaska. That's how good he was. You need this ice maker. And so you'd think that there would be this great showdown, and it was billed that way. But it's fascinating to read, and I hope I did justice in summarizing them, but it's fascinating to watch Madison cut Henry to absolute pieces, and also George Mason as well, to boot. George Mason was the godfather of the intellectual Virginia republicanism, and Madison it's like a vivisection. And Henry, who is so angry about all of this, decides to draw congressional districts to keep Madison out of Congress.
Right.
Even goes so far as to convince Madison's friend Monroe to run against him. And Madison manages to win comfortably. He won in the 5th congressional district. He won 57% of the vote. It's just such a remarkable. And, if you look at the history of Madison's political career, there were only, I would say, 2 things where he was ever sort of befuddled by. The first was the meteoric rise of Hamiltonian finance in the 1790s. Hamilton really did manage to box him out. And the second, I think, was the obstreperousness and the stubbornness of the British in negotiating a mutually agreeable sort of treaty or something to avert war in 1812. Those are the 2 things. He just could not outfox. He could not outfox the British, and he couldn't outfox Hamilton. But I would say overall his track record, though, all told, would be like 40-2 if he were a boxer, which is pretty impressive for a 40
that's great.
Yeah,
that's great. That is great. Yeah, there was a French observer who said he's someone you have to study for a long time before you come to a just appreciation of him. That he said he is less brilliant than Mr. Hamilton, but more profound.
Yes, that's probably the best, and so often the case with the French. They often have a way of just capturing things just perfectly, and I think better than we Americans ever could, and I think that pretty much sums it up.
Well, and you did a great job of summing it up too in the book.
Oh, thank
James Madison, America's First Politician. We've been talking with Jay Cost from Grove City College's Institute for Faith and Freedom, and a fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, and author of James Madison, America's First Politician. Jay, it's been great talking with you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our listeners. As I was saying, we have folks all over the world, all over the country tuning in, Southampton, England, as well as Borden in Hampshire, and in Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Germany, and Hungary, and Mishawaka, Indiana, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Gorham, Maine, Redondo Beach, California, all points in between. Thank you all for listening. If you have an idea for something you'd like to hear about, send me an email, rallison@suffolk.edu. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. Thanks, Jay, and thanks, everyone.